everyone. Happy New Year. We're going to get started here. I know there will be more joining us in just a minute. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I am the director of the China Center. Thank you for joining us today for the University of Minnesota's China Center's Considering China webinar with Professor Nason Mahboubi. He'll talk about what's next for U.S. China relations under Trump 2.0. I thank you for your support of the China Center and this Considering China webinar series. A special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their support of this program. We invite you to help us provide engaging program like this with a gift to the China Center. You may do so through a link at the webinar announcement or on our website. There will be a Q&A directly following the presentation. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It'll be available to you throughout the program, and we'll answer as many of those questions as possible at the end. Professor Mahboubi is the director of the Penn Project at the Penn Project on the Future of U.S. China Relations at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches various courses related to Chinese history, law, policy, and hosts a Chinese studies podcast. He's also a non-resident senior fellow in the Asia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. His primary academic interests are in the areas of administrative law, comparative law, and Chinese law, and his current writing focuses on the development of modern Chinese administrative law. He's also taught at Princeton's University of School of Public and International Affairs and the University of Connecticut School of Law and the Yale Law School. Please welcome Professor Nason Mahboubi. I hope that we've given you enough time. It seems like the last 2 weeks are packed full of things to discuss. So we welcome you and look forward to your discussion.
Thank you so much, Joan, and for this incredibly kind invitation. I should mention that I received your invitation just after a good friend of mine had visited Minneapolis and had come back saying that the food scene in Minneapolis is outstanding. Apparently a lot of chefs from Brooklyn have relocated to Minneapolis. And so when I first received your invitation, I was delighted to have the chance to come and sample this incredible food scene. And then I saw it was a virtual. So I will have to delay my my exploration of the Minneapolis food scene until maybe another opportunity. But of course, I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with your community, even virtually, today. As you mentioned, I am the director of the Penn Project on the Future of U.S.-China Relations. Let me just say a word about that, because it does, of course, relate very closely to our topic today. The Penn Project tries to contribute to policy discourse in the United States about China at this really difficult and fraught moment in U.S.-China relations by elevating and amplifying recommendations from next-generation China scholars and experts who we select through a competitive process. So every year, we select a class of fellows, of established professionals in academic jobs or in think tanks and policy world who have genuine specialized knowledge about some aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. And over the course of this one-year non-residential fellowship, they develop concrete, actionable recommendations for U.S. policymakers rooted in their specialized knowledge. And so what we are really trying to do is bring more knowledge, expertise, specialization into policy discourse, and in particular, by elevating next-generation voices. If you are following our project, you will know that we are currently in the process of publishing the papers of our second fellowship cohort. We'll have a webinar later today with the group in our second fellowship cohort who write about technology. And we have just put out the call for applications for the third fellowship cohort, which would be something that I hope people will apply for. Maybe some people who are watching this discussion today will select and announce that third fellowship cohort a little later this spring. So that's what I do. That's the core of what the Penn Project does. And the particular background that I bring to this is of a legal scholar who has spent practically my entire career, going all the way back to when I was in college, looking at the development of Chinese administrative law. If you see the photo just above my shoulder to the back, that's a photo of me at a conference in Shanghai some 10 years ago, as one of the only two non-Chinese and only two Americans who was sitting in on a meeting about the revision of China's administrative litigation law, the law that lets Chinese citizens sue the government when they feel the government has acted illegally or abusively. And so the world that I have inhabited when I have been studying China and thinking about China for well over almost, I would say, just about 3 decades, has been this world of legal reformers in the Chinese context who are trying within the system to, and some of them ultimately outside of the system, but mostly within the system, trying to make Chinese governance more fair, more just, more regularized, more predictable, including through vehicles like the administrative litigation law. And that's really the root of my perspective on what is happening in China, what has happened over the last 3 decades that I've been studying. That's what I bring to the table. And at this moment where our relationship with China is so much in the public discourse, and there are lots of people who are engaging in the discourse, and many of them have deep expertise, and some of them, frankly, don't. Everyone kind of comes at these questions from a particular angle. They all have a piece of the puzzle, and the piece of the puzzle that has always been my particular piece has been this connectivity to legal reformers in China who are not satisfied with the current state of affairs and who are trying to make for a better, more just, more fair China. That's my window. And it's out of the deep connectivity with that kind of group that I so much prioritize specialization, knowledge, expertise, but including having a sense of being on the ground in China and knowing those dynamics. Because some of those dynamics, for example, the dynamics with the legal reform community that I just alluded to, some of those dynamics are less visible from abroad. It's easier to have a deeper sense of those dynamics if you are able to go to China. So I've very much lent my voice to the notion that it's important for us as Americans, not only to study China, to do our best to build up our knowledge from here, but also to go to China to have real on-the-ground experience. And of course, with a critical eye. I think in a lot of ways, the discourse today about whether or not to go to China to try to do research in China not only thinks about questions of safety, and I perfectly understand that and very mindful of that, but also wonders whether if an American goes to China, they somehow become, corrupted, or they see things through a overly Chinese lens, they lose their sense of perspective. And my own view is that when we go to China as American scholars, whether as students or faculty, undergraduates, graduate students, of course, we should maintain our critical faculties and do as much as we can to learn as much as we can. That's the purpose of exchange, not just to go and, as I say, have nice meals and see folk dancing or things like that, but rather to actually learn things. And as long as there is any window in which to learn things, I am very happy to lend my own voice to encouraging colleagues, to the extent that they feel safe to do so, to go and do that. And understanding that that window to learn things is closing and has become more difficult than it was before. But as long as there's any degree of window, then I think it's important we take advantage of that. So I say all of that as a very lengthy self-introduction, just so that you can understand kind of the own personal perspectives that I bring to these questions, the long time engagement, frankly, with Chinese interlocutors and study of China, and how all of that feeds not only into the presentation that I'm about to deliver here, but also the work that I'm doing with the Penn Project on the future of U.S. China relations. So moving now more robustly into our topic of the day, what is the future of U.S. China relations in our current vantage point in the early days of the second Trump administration? I think to sort of best understand this particular moment, and we're all reading the news, we know that we may be on the cusp of a second trade war. We know that President Trump has just announced another round of tariffs on Chinese imports, adding to the tariffs that his administration levied in his first term and that the Biden administration did not reduce. If anything, they increased them. We know that China, according to the reporting of one of the great reporters of U.S. China relations, Ling Wei at the Wall Street Journal. We know that China has put forward a deal that seeks to appeal to the transactional side of President Trump, and particularly on trade issues. And we know that that is, part of the negotiation between U.S. and Chinese economic officials. And we also know that China has started to formulate retaliatory tariffs in response to the tariffs that President Trump announced a few days ago. This is all stuff that's happening within the trade context, but as I will elaborate a little more down the road in this presentation, this is maybe the opening salvos in a wider confrontational dynamic that has been building up for all the reasons I'm about to mention. So all of this is to say we're having this conversation together at a very, I think, important moment in U.S.-China relations, where we see some stuff that has happened and that we'll talk about, but a lot of other things we don't know yet, and we will have to, all of us, watch closely in the next weeks and months and maybe years ahead. But in order to kind of situate where we are with all of these current dynamics, I think I want to just emphasize a few background points, setting the context for the broad range of issues that we'll hone in on in a moment. And in sort of thinking through what to emphasize in this broader context, at least 5 or 6 points seem especially salient to me. The first is to underscore not just how closely intertwined the U.S. and China have been leading up to the last few years, certainly economically, certainly in terms of people to people exchange, but that is something that has been the case for decades, and was also the case prior to the 1949 Communist Revolution, which ushered in a few, at least maybe a decade, arguably 2 decades of basically no contact. I say that just because I think there's a difference between the 1950s and the 1960s. The 1950s were genuinely a time of almost zero contact, in fact, conflict on the Korean Peninsula. But in the 1960s, leading up to Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's visits to China, there was a beginning uptick of some connectivity. But certainly before 1949, we were deeply intertwined as societies. And that story goes back really to the latter part of the Qing dynasty, and a period of time when, of all the foreign powers, especially Western powers, and Japan, who were in various ways involved in China, the United States had the best reputation. We were, in the words of some friends of mine from China, will say that the U.S. Americans were considered the, quote, good barbarians, who were marginally more, public-spirited minded in their interactions with China, including as reflected in our open door policy, including in our very robust advocacy for the notion that China should remain territorially intact and not be split up, and including in that we used some of the money from the Boxer indemnity to actually fund Chinese students coming to the United States, and to fund the development of Chinese institutions like Tsinghua University. So this is all just a lot of detail that I'm basically using to indicate that this is a very, very deep, long-standing, and closely intertwined relationship that, frankly, I don't know has any clear analog in terms of American relationships with other countries. I think there's something really unique and distinctive about this, and anything that we talk about of like this moment of rupture now, I think, should at least be informed by understanding of how deep the connectivity was before 1949, but certainly after the normalization of relations in 1979 and onward. The second point, which sort of builds on that, is that the process of reform and opening in China from 1979 onwards, that is most often, of course, associated with then leader Deng Xiaoping, was deeply connected with the United States. We were not only the party that was engaging in business activities and sending students, welcoming Chinese students to the U.S. Famously, President Carter asked Deng Xiaoping in the discussions around that time how many Chinese students he wanted to be able to send to the U.S. And Deng Xiaoping jokingly said, "How many can you take?" Right? So the U.S. was deeply a part of those reform and opening dynamics, but also we helped to structure them because we did see the benefits to our national interest of China being a different kind of an economy that was more closely tied with the liberal international order. And that was a place where American business could, frankly, make money and pursue our business interests. So against the backdrop of this, long time history, we also have a particularly close intertwining over the course of the last few decades, and that has included both the things that I've mentioned, both business but also student exchange. Of course, many more Chinese students have come to the U.S. than U.S. students going to China. I think at the height of American students going to China, maybe it was about 15,000 or so. But the number of Chinese students, certainly, and we're talking about collegiate level and above, was well over 300,000. So there is a differential there, but still, that's a lot of traffic going back and forth. That, of course, at this current moment, we're particularly concerned about the number of American students who are going to China. The third point is that all of these dynamics were very deeply affected by China's entry into the WTO and the phenomenal growth in the Chinese economy after that, which has so much strengthened not only China's position on the world stage, but China's state itself, which was very, very weak at the beginning of the reform and opening period. This is a dynamic that we maybe in the U.S. context did not fully anticipate. I think if you go back and you look at the debates in the 90s over China's accession to the WTO, there clearly was an understanding that this would benefit the Chinese economy, and those who were arguing for it understood that it would benefit the economy. But I don't think anyone, even the people who were against it, fully anticipated how much the Chinese economy would just explode after China's entry to the WTO, even understanding that China's economy had done very well in the decades of reform and opening up to that point. That fact of China, becoming a much more dominant economic and military power after 2001 clearly shapes the landscape for a change in relations between the U.S. and China going forward. This was happening at a time initially where we were in the United States largely distracted by September 11th and the ensuing war on terror. So there was a period of time in the 2000s where, were it not for those things, perhaps the U.S. political establishment would have focused more on China's phenomenal growth and rise at the time. But we became ultimately more focused on it in the years after the global financial crisis in 2008. So in the latter part of the Obama administration already, I think there was a lot of clarity on both the Democratic and Republican sides of the aisle that China's phenomenal growth and its economic emergence as really our only true competitor on the economic stage, and consequently also its growth in its military, meant that China was a different kind of country than the country that we were dealing with in the 1970s, 1980s, and even 1990s. And so to the extent that there has been a shift in what is often referred to as the, quote, bipartisan consensus on China, it is rooted in empirical reality that China has become a different kind of a country that poses different kinds of landscape to U.S. policymakers and frankly, challenges. The last thing I want to mention in this lead up is, of course, the significance of the rise of Chinese President Xi Jinping, because one could imagine the possibility, at least theoretically, that a different Chinese leader would have presided over, China becoming economically so powerful and militarily so strong in a way that was less aggressive vis-a-vis the outside world, and also perhaps less control-minded internally. Theoretically, perhaps that's possible, and we can debate that. We can debate whether the changes in Chinese governance over the last decade are largely or entirely because of the particular preferences of the top guy, or if they are, the direction that China would have gone anyway, and he simply was part of that wave. But in any case, however we resolve that question, it is clear that over the last decade, which coincides with the period of time that President Xi Jinping has been in power, that China has become more control-oriented at home, more repressive at home, and has perhaps moved away from the economic liberalization that so much dominated the approach of the Chinese economy in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and has become more aggressive on the world stage. So it's not just that China has become more powerful economically and militarily, but it also presents a picture to U.S. policymakers of a country that is no longer progressing in the direction of political reform that many thought it was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, is no longer progressing in the same direction of economic reform, and is approaching its status on the world stage in a more aggressive way than it had before. So all of this feeds into this new, and again, I think is largely bipartisan consensus to view China as more of a challenge than we had viewed it before. And so oftentimes the period of engagement, the earlier period, is dated from, certainly post Mao engagement from 1978 to 2016. 2016, of course, that is a consequential moment because it coincides with the rise now in the United States of President Trump and the first Trump administration. What I've been trying to emphasize in all of this background is that there's a lot of depth to these dynamics that transcend any particular individual, and that includes President Xi Jinping in China. President Trump is not the first person in the American political establishment who had concerns about China or who thought that China's rise posed a new kind of challenge to the United States. But he was an accelerant to some of the American response to that. I think people on both sides of the aisle would agree with that. His particular lens in his first administration, for much of it, was trade. I think it's well understood that President Trump has a very particular mindset about what it means to be in an economic competition with China. What are the metrics to look at? And he looks very specifically at trade imbalances. How much are they exporting to us? How much are we exporting to them? And from that very particular viewpoint, which was, I think, rooted in his own personal feeling about how economics works. If you go back in the 80s and you see what he was saying about Japan at the time, it was very similar. Out of that came the political mobilization for the initial trade war between the U.S. and China from the U.S. side. And that was launched with the imposition of tariffs from the Trump administration. Now, the vehicle for doing that was people like Robert Lighthizer, who was then the U.S. trade representative, who perhaps had a broader view of U.S. China competition than even President Trump. That's a dynamic I will return to in a moment, but it was certainly true in the first Trump administration that President Trump's particular window on this was narrower than those of many of the people who were advising him on prosecuting the case. In the first Trump administration, that dynamic basically meant that he spoke a lot about tariffs. He spoke a lot about the ways in which, in his view, China was cheating us, and how that dynamic had led to a devastating consequences for U.S. manufacturing, especially in the Midwest, among many of the people who had voted for him. But he was not, and I mean President Trump, was not speaking of China and the threat or the challenge from China in broader terms. You would very rarely, if at all, come across a language from President Trump that certainly never criticizes Xi Jinping, but also never really talks about China as an existential threat. As some have said, President Trump views China the same way he viewed Japan in the 80s, the way he views perhaps Canada and Mexico today, an economic competitor that needs to be put in its place, but not any greater degree of challenge. I don't think that was the case for many of the people in his administration. at the time in the first administration. And there were people like Secretary Pompeo at the State Department, Matt Pottinger at the National Security Council, and others, and I would argue also Robert Lighthizer as USTR, who were interested in a more robust competition with China across a wider range of vectors. To a large extent, they did not have the room to really push those agendas during the first Trump administration until the onset of COVID. Once COVID happened and it became clear that President Trump himself saw this virus that he saw as originating in China as a direct threat to his own political fortunes, which it turned out to be, in many ways, he let off the guardrails on all the other people in his administration who wanted to prosecute a much more aggressive case against China. And so you see in that last year of the Trump administration a real difference. Even though the first few years of the Trump administration had the trade war and it was in many ways very aggressive, there's a completely different flavor from 2020 onwards, where you have comments and speeches that really indicate a much broader competition, including language, including in a famous speech that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave at the Nixon Library. That's right, the Nixon Library, maybe the Reagan Library, but I think it's the Nixon Library. That is, many could think basically amounted to a call for regime change. And it was that type of relationship that the Biden administration inherited when they came into power in 2021. They came into power at a moment that was the lowest moment that I can recall in U.S. China relations, in which it was not just the trade competition, but a deeper sense that we were locked in essentially almost an existential struggle that was something about our way of life and their way of life, and only one could survive. And in my view, the Biden administration did a lot over the last 4 years to maintain the axis of competition, but to tone down some of the more aggressive rhetoric that portrayed China as some kind of an existential threat. Others could argue that, but at least that's my vista on the last 4 years of the Biden administration, is that they were just as aggressive as the Trump administration in prosecuting the economic case. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the tariffs did not come down. We continued to strengthen export controls. We continued to put restrictions on Chinese investment in the United States. They also even increased tariffs. Towards the end of his tenure, President Biden put a 100% tariff on Chinese electrical vehicles coming into the United States. So I think they would say, and I did not serve in the Biden administration, have no particular reason to carry water for them, but I think they would say that they did prosecute the trade relationship, the economic relationship, as aggressively, if not more aggressively, than the Trump administration had. But they, at the same time, tamped down some of the more hostile rhetoric that we saw towards the end of the Trump administration, and did their best to at least stabilize some level of connectivity, certainly people-to-people exchange, in the aftermath of the COVID controls coming down in 2022. You will see lots of statements from Biden administration officials, including then Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns, but also other officials, saying that it was in the American national interest for American students not only to study China, to understand China, but to go to China, to be on the ground. For much of the Biden administration, there was a level 3 travel warning on Americans traveling to China, which had, as many of you will know, had a negative effect on the interest of Americans going to China. But they reduced that to level 2 even after the election, in the last few weeks of the Biden administration. And so what they were trying to do was to communicate that they were prosecuting an economic case against China aggressively and across multiple vectors, but still maintaining some ability to have a more collaborative dynamic on people-to-people exchange, on student exchange, perhaps on global common goods like health, environment. Secretary, or then, I guess I forget his exact title at the time, but John Kerry, the president's climate negotiator, was deeply in discussion with his Chinese counterpart, Xie Jianhua, over the course of the Biden administration. So that was a second part. And then thirdly, the Biden administration thinking about the security dimensions of the U.S. China relationship, and in particular thinking about the status of Taiwan and American essentially commitments to Taiwan, and the desire to maintain American primacy in the Asia Pacific, worked a lot with allies and partners through lots of different vehicles, including AUKUS, to kind of demonstrate that the U.S. was not acting alone in the region, that the U.S. had allies and partners in Japan, Korea, Australia, and many other countries, including in Southeast Asia, to try to exercise some kind of deterrent signaling vis-a-vis what could be viewed as aggressive Chinese actions, not only against Taiwan, but also in the South China Sea. So that's where we were just about a month ago, before President Trump came into power again, Trump 2.0. And so we're all now thinking, and my topic for today is what happens now? Where do we go from here? I think it's a fast-moving picture, and there's a lot of points that are not clear. But let me lay out a few things that I think we can see at this point, and then suggest what we should be looking for in the period ahead. The first is that certainly many of the people around President Trump, many people from the Republican foreign policy establishment, many of the people that he's putting in positions of authority, do think that a Biden administration approach to China was simply managing dynamics that we should be more aggressive about. That we should not be simply thinking about the trade relationship, but we should be thinking in terms of a broader conflict, or at least confrontational dynamic with Beijing, and should be more active across more vectors than the Biden administration was. I think it's fair to say that that is generally the perspective among many of the people who are part of the Republican foreign policy establishment generally, but are also part of the groups that are advising President Trump, and that President Trump has put in positions of authority in his new administration. What seems to be the case from the outside, and I say this with great humility because I don't know for sure, but what seems to be the case from the outside is that President Trump himself may not feel as strongly about all of that broader scope of competition than some of the people that he's listening to and putting in positions of authority. It seems from the outside that President Trump cares mostly about the trade relationship, the same kind of thing that he cared about in his first administration, and in the same way that he views the trade relationship with other countries like Canada and Mexico, not necessarily viewing China in a deeper existential threat lens. Now, again, I'm saying this as someone from the outside. I have never met President Trump. I don't know for sure. But from all the available reporting, from what we're seeing in terms of the statements, that seems a plausible frame of analysis, that there is some differential there between his own views, his own approach to this, and that of much of his team. And so the big question is, how does that dynamic now play out over the coming years? It is entirely plausible for Beijing to put together a trade deal along the ways that Ling Wei, the Wall Street Journal, reported on a few days ago, that really is designed to satisfy what they understand to be President Trump's particular economic concerns. And so if you go and you read her report of what Beijing has basically offered in this initial phase, they are offering to live up to the purchasing commitments of the trade deal that was signed in 2019, and that many have thought that China did not live up to the terms of that trade deal, in part obviously because of COVID, but maybe for other reasons as well. They have made commitments not to try to destabilize the dollar. They have in this offer, in this reported on offer, they have made commitments to try to restrict the flow of fentanyl in the United States, which we actually do know that President Trump cares quite a lot about, and is part of the rationale for the new round of tariffs. These are things that I think are very narrowly tailored to what they think and what seems from the outside that President Trump particularly cares about. He particularly cares about a number that you can demonstrate that shows that imports into China from the United States have expanded and are more in line with Chinese exports to the United States. If I were in a position to guess what happens next, I would not be able to, because firstly, it's unclear that the deal that the Chinese have put forward is one that will appeal to President Trump, if that's what he's looking for, if he's looking for more or different. But also, it seems unlikely that a agreement just on these trade issues will be enough to resolve all the wider range of issues that in the general U.S. context we care about, but we especially know that members of Trump's foreign policy team care a lot about. We don't really know how this deal would affect, for example, tensions in the South China Sea, or tensions over Taiwan, or concerns that many in the Trump administration rightly have about China's crackdown in Hong Kong, or of course, China's persecution of the Uyghurs. So to the extent that the landscape of U.S.-China disagreement is a much broader landscape, it's hard to see how, certainly I don't think anyone is suggesting there's the possibility of a grand bargain that resolves all of those. I think that is beyond anyone's capacity. I think these are going to be issues that are with us for a long time and that we're going to disagree with in various ways for a long time. But can a part of a deal that is just focused on the trade part, is that if it is even feasible, will that have a broader effect on that broader landscape? I think is a really unclear and unknown question. We should first see if the deal is even made before we reach that conclusion. As to whether the deal will be made, I think among the factors that go into it are the relative state of the U.S. and Chinese economies. It does seem at the moment that the U.S. economy is actually doing quite well, and we know by all accounts that the Chinese economy is doing quite poorly. So, a deal that basically comes out of a mutual recognition of relative strength there could have more, could maybe go more forward than a deal otherwise would, because we do know that for all sorts of reasons, the Chinese economy is doing poorly. Another factor that could be in the mix is that it does seem clear that, like the Biden administration, the Trump administration would want Chinese help in trying to resolve the war in Ukraine. Certainly that, possibly also they might even be thinking of the conflict in Gaza and Israel-Palestine, but certainly the war in Ukraine, I think there's some interest in seeing if the Chinese can contribute to the end of what has been an enormously destabilizing conflict there. So that could go into some of this discussion. And I think it's also relevant that the Trump administration is perhaps less demonstratively assertive in reaching out to allies and partners in both Asia, but also in Europe, which may afford a chance for Beijing to increase its leverage by reaching out to those types of countries that the Biden administration was very solicitous of, and it's possible that the Trump administration may not be. All of those factors will really determine what the next initial steps are going to be in at least the next months or even year. But what I want to conclude on for now, and I'm really interested to hear your reactions and have a dialogue, is that whatever these particular next steps are going to look like, whether or not there is, let's say, a trade deal, whether or not tariffs continue to escalate. At the moment, President Trump has said that the tariffs could escalate to as much as 60%, but for now they're at 10%. Meanwhile, the retaliatory tariffs from the Chinese side are very carefully tailored to hit things like natural gas that we don't really export to China. They have not yet put tariffs on the only thing that we really do export, which is soybeans. That would demonstrate that they are really more interested in prosecuting a real trade war. So those things are important, but the point that I want to conclude on is, regardless of that, the deeper drivers that are bringing the U.S. and China into a more contentious relationship are going to survive. They are too deep-seated. It is just baked in that the U.S. and China are both economic competitors, military competitors, both with different visions of governance. And that competition is certainly going to intensify. And so what I essentially can only hope for is that as that competition surely intensifies, one, I certainly would count myself among those who hope that it doesn't spill into outright conflict. I think, hopefully that's not too uh, controversial a position to say that I hope we don't get to a point of an outright war between the U.S. and China. But secondly, I hope that while the two countries and the two governments are locked in this escalating competition, that we can still find ways to maintain connectivity at the people-to-people level. That has been challenging for a long time. It has gotten especially challenging in the last 5 to 10 years, and will only get more challenging in the period ahead. But that is where I basically land in all of this, is that whatever else is going on, it's important to do our best to maintain those kinds of ties, and particularly scholarly and academic ties, of having Chinese students be here in the US, of having American students go to China. It may not be enough of a ballast to really prevent much more confrontational dynamics across other areas, but it is something that has some meaning to it, and that I think can at least tide us over until the future, when perhaps for all sorts of other reasons, we may be able to find a more beneficial relationship than is certainly going to be the case for the foreseeable future. So let me close with that, and again, I'm really eager to hear from all of you.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating discussion and presentation. I encourage all of you to put your Q&A or your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So, it's interesting to me how you talked a little bit about the connectivity and how you personally connected to the law community in China, and giving that perspective. Who do you see in the Trump administration that has those connections, or has some of that expertise that can be advising, Trump, either him or his subordinates, on trade and just relationship related kinds of exchanges?
Yeah, so I don't know the full scope of the Trump-China team. And I mean, I think we could define it as, let's say one definition would include career people who are still there. And then another definition would be a narrower subset of political appointees. But I don't have the full vantage point. Certainly there are a lot of people in career jobs who have deep connectivity on the ground in China, who have spent, a significant amount of time in the same ways that I think myself and many of my academic colleagues have. My perspective on this is partly shaped by the fact that even in the Biden administration, where there were not just those career people, but even people that I can think of that are, political appointees who had that kind of experience. I would say that the Biden administration was rhetorically supportive of some connectivity. And in particular, Ambassador Burns, I think, gets a lot of credit for that. But I don't think the Biden administration went out of their way in any shape or form to make connectivity possible. I think connectivity was difficult in those years. The rhetorical support was nice and appreciated, but was in many ways largely just that, was just the rhetorical support. So it's hard for me. I certainly cannot in a position to say that there's going to be a major shift. The only shift that I could anticipate would be that rhetorical support would end, that even just the broad notion that it's okay for American students to go to China. It's okay for Chinese students to come here. It's possible that that rhetoric could shift. There are certainly some people in the Trump team who would change that rhetoric. But to the extent that President Trump himself doesn't seem to, necessarily be opposed to those, maybe there's some room for that. But if there are certainly political appointees who would at least have the kind of experience that some of the political appointees in the Biden administration had, um, which they didn't necessarily do anything about, but at least had that experience. I don't know. I don't know the full range. I mean, there's certainly lots of people who have knowledge about China and have deep expertise, but like who have connectivity. The only name that really comes to mind off the top of my own head, the new U.S. ambassador to China, former Georgia Senator Perdue, who for many years, was doing business in relation to China, so has, that level of experience. But otherwise, there's no one that leaps to mind as I sit here today.
Thank you. All right. So how does the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act also might play into today's fraught relations? Are we recycling and continuing to cycle through our past experiences?
Yeah, and so I had the opportunity to teach a course on the history of U.S. China relations last year that's normally taught by my colleague here at Penn. But I think the takeaway that I have from dynamics like that is that we have to be careful to both see where there are continuities, but also not make the mistake of assuming that all the facts and all the situation are so similar that they're like immediately clear connectivity. Um, the broad connectivity could be that when we feel that there is some kind of a threat from another, and in this case, in both cases with relation to China, that manifests itself in actions like the Chinese Exclusion Acts, or arguably in some ways the what is sometimes referred to as the China Initiative of the last few years, where the Justice Department and the FBI were particularly looking at Chinese scientists. But they are not the same thing. And so we have to be very careful to kind of differentiate that, and to understand that, whatever, the concern that motivated a lot of the Chinese Exclusion Acts was the influx of Chinese migrant labor that was taking jobs away from, Americans. Now, whether that was fair, the way in which the laborers were put to use, how much was informed by just much more negative, racism, frankly, that's a debate we can have. But the current moment is not that. The current moment, I think we have to be clear-eyed about. There is, these are not migrant laborers coming from a decaying imperial empire, right? To the extent that there are concerns in the U.S. that relate to China, it's because China is a peer competitor economically, militarily, that is aggressively trying to advance, and at the expense of the United States. Whether or not, and we can have this debate about whether China wants to displace the United States entirely, we can put that aside and at least all stipulate that we understand that China is trying to advance at the expense of the United States. That's just different. And so, we have to obviously guard against nativism and racism and targeting. But I also think that we have to be careful not to think that there's no reason whatsoever to be concerned about the dynamics that are unleashed when we have a near competitor economically and politically, militarily, that does want to go ahead of us. And so wise policy ultimately has to balance all of this, and reach the best adjustment possible. And my only hope is that we can put as much knowledge into that policymaking process as we can, so that it is indeed wise policy.
Thank you. In the 21st century, outright conflict may look more like electronic or other like the underseas cable conflict in Europe, interference in communications or infrastructure, and not kinetic warfare per se. What's your perspective on the security risks posed by China in the U.S.-China relations going forward?
Sure. And I should be very clear that even though I am, running this project in U.S.-China relations, I'm a legal scholar. So my particular expertise, if you want to ask me about provisions of, the Chinese administrative litigation law revision of 2014 and how it affects judicial reform, that's where I feel most comfortable. Kinetic warfare is not something that I know a lot about. So I just want to be very, very clear and upfront that I am not your best expert on different kinds of warfare. But I will venture out of beyond my skis just a little bit to say that certainly it seems that Pentagon planners across different administrations are clear about that they are thinking not just in terms of kinetic warfare, but in terms of other kinds of conflict. And it is clear that Chinese capacity in those respects is real, significant, and a cause for concern. So to the extent that, planners in the Pentagon are thinking along those lines, that seems entirely appropriate and necessary for thinking about protecting American national security. But whether those dynamics are more likely or less likely than kinetic warfare, that certainly is something I would defer to the military experts to speak to.
What are your thoughts about the evolution of the U.S.-China relationship after Trump and Xi complete their tenures?
I think that is a question that I think a lot about, and I'm very happy to speak on at length. I think that both of those figures have been accelerants to dynamics that have brought the U.S. and China into greater conflict with one another. But so accelerants means that they are not the only factor, that other factors have gone into it and they have kind of contributed to furthering of those dynamics. But they are real accelerants. And once the two of them have passed off this landscape, it is going to be interesting to see if other leaders will take different approaches, both domestically, but then also internationally and vis-a-vis each other, that would move things in a different direction. We can't anticipate who those leaders would be. I think just as much as anyone who's viewing this in the United States would not know what is the next political leader in the U.S. going to look like after President Trump. I think we have even less clarity. It's even more opaque what the leader after President Xi would be because of the way in which he structured governance and made it very hard to predict in ways that were much easier to predict. We knew that he was going to be the leader of China for a decade before he was the leader. We really don't know who the next leader in China was going to be. But what we do know is that neither of them will be in those positions forever. There are some ironclad natural laws that neither one of them will be able to avoid. And so there will be a difference. What that will look like, we will see then. But I think to the extent that we can keep at least some level of people-to-people connectivity from now till then, that will be useful to have in the picture when that moment comes. It may not have enough, to structure things differently after, but at least I think it's useful to keep that connectivity, as difficult as it is, from now till then. And that's certainly something that I try to do.
Other than the trade relationship, are there any other relationships, such as maybe mutual investment, that are strongly affected by our new policies? Any difference from the Biden government till now?
So one thing that is clearly very interesting is that the Biden administration was quite, I think, skeptical of Chinese investment in the U.S. And an argument that you would sometimes hear in relation to that would be people saying, look, for all these years that we were investing in China, there were all these dynamics of, some would say forced technology transfer that we feel like we lost out on. Our particular, technological advantage was eroded because of the dynamics of forced technology transfer. And so some would argue and have argued that to the extent that now China is actually leading in certain technologies like EVs, like batteries, um, why not have them? Why don't we do the same thing essentially? Why don't we have them come and bring, investment in the U.S. and build plants here that we can learn from? So, that has been an interesting debate in the latter parts of the Biden administration, where the administration on the whole was very, very, I think, skeptical, but there would be voices saying, look, like, what exactly is the threat here? And couldn't we make this work to our advantage? What I think is super interesting is that President Trump himself actually seems okay with Chinese investment in the U.S. and largely for the similar kind of reasons. Again, to the extent that we can tell that he is not a existential threat person. He's just like, let's find advantage where we can find it person. That kind of argument, have Chinese come and build plants here that then we can like learn from them and kind of do the same thing they did to us. You can see how that naturally has an appeal to what I think is the way that President Trump views these things. But I don't know that people around him would have the same view. And so whether or not, there is a more or less restrictive environment for, let's say, Chinese investment in the U.S. will depend not just on his perspective, but on where the people around him come down. And, one thing that we can pay close attention to in the coming weeks and months is if this trade negotiation that certainly the Chinese have put forward an idea, and President Trump seems interested in at least having that negotiation. If that does conclude, maybe that, opens the way to, broader trade relationships, including mutual investment. But if it doesn't go through, then certainly one can imagine that the people around him who are more skeptical of those dynamics would have descendants.
And how do you think, or how optimistic are you about the Taiwan future, or future of Taiwan under the new administration?
Yeah, so I think this is, and I'm glad it came up, because I think it's the most challenging issue in this overall environment. And it's really important to understand that and to think really, really carefully about what is the path forward. My own view, personally, is that we, as the United States, have a real, meaningful, and robust commitment to Taiwan that is both vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also in terms of our presence in the Asia Pacific. I think we play, I'm a child of the 90s. I believe that for all of our flaws, the U.S. continues to play a really important stabilizing role on the world stage and in regions like the Asia Pacific. And so in order to continue to play that role, I think it's really important that we are clear about our support for Taiwan and our interest in maintaining the status quo, and certainly not seeing any kind of conflict over Taiwan, any kind of non-peaceful resolution. I think we have to be very clear in our messaging that that is not something that the U.S. could abide by. At the same time, this status quo has been informed by not just the deterrence that I was just alluding to, but also reassurance to Beijing that the understanding that was the foundation for Kissinger's first meeting with Zhou Enlai and Nixon's, discussions with Mao and Jimmy Carter's discussions with Deng Xiaoping, that we are not supporting a change in the status quo at the very least. Like, I think that is important messaging for us to continue to convey. And I think just about anyone who looks at this issue closely would agree with that combination of deterrence of Beijing and assurance to Beijing, that combination is important. What is unclear going forward is whether, one, that calibration is even technically possible anymore, we live in a different time from the 1970s, 1980s. Taiwan is not the Taiwan of the 1970s and 1980s. And so, and the Taiwanese people have their own agency. So that is a complicating factor. President Xi Jinping's often stated desire to reunify, which is more or less the same as prior leaders, but he has perhaps put a little bit more vim and vigor into the rhetoric. That is a factor. And what is exactly our level of support, our level of commitment is a factor where I think some note that there are people around Trump who would be very, very clear about their support for Taiwan, but it's not always clear that President Trump himself is as clear. So all of those are destabilizing factors that I don't have a crystal ball for how they play out, but I think it's incredibly important that we do everything we can through wise policy to maintain the status quo. And so we have to figure it out one way or another in the coming years.
We have come to time, and I really appreciative of your time today with us. It was a really insightful talk, and the U.S. China relationship landscape is changing by the minute. I'm sure we can invite you back next week and have a whole nother talk.
I'm always ready to talk about the 2014 revision of the administrative litigation law. So anyone who wants to hear that, my phone is available, standing by.
Excellent. And we have to bring you to Minneapolis for the food, but
great.
You've given us really excellent framework to analyze many facets of this relationship. So thank you for your excellent discussion today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Best wishes to all of you for a happy, healthy, and prosperous year of the snake. 新年好，蛇年大吉. Hope to see you again soon. We should have another webinar next month. More information coming. All the best to everybody. Thank you.